It's Patrick at Pals. Well, we're back in Florida. 2,562 miles of steady travel over 10 days. So, we actually had 6 days, a little over 6 days of travel, because it took 3 days to get to Illinois. And then, after being in Illinois for almost 3 days, 2.5 days, we drove to Auburn, Indiana, which was 240 miles. We left at 7:30 at night. We got in 2 a.m. the morning of the show. And then that day, Sophie, the 48 Buick, went out on the show field and won a preservation award. Now, at the AACA, in order to be judged in a class, as this car is, it's judged in 46 to 48 regular production cars. That excludes Fords. Fords have their own judging, and that's because there's so many of them. But these cars are judged with the Chryslers and the Pontiacs and the Chevrolets. But Fords, they've got their own. Of course, Studebaker would go into this model as well. At any rate, we drove those 240 miles to Auburn, and the car won a preservation award. It's got a total of 400 points to be judged from, and they subtract for everything that isn't original. Now, they realize it might have been replaced, but it has to look and function the same as the original did. In other words, you couldn't have, well, you could put air conditioning on the car, but you'd get a huge deduction in points. Everything has to look like it was in 1948. And this car did very well. We know that it got at least 350 points because you need that to get a preservation award, which a preservation award is as high as you can go at a regular judged meet. The first one you win is a junior, then you win a senior, and then, unless it's a Grand National, you go for a preservation, which is what Sophie did, and she won. So that means she's the best of the best, and that's after being driven almost 1,500 miles to the meet. Most of those cars were trailered in. This one was driven there. My nearest competitor for driving had only driven 300 miles. So most people were pretty enthused that I'd driven the car that far. They were very happy to see it, and it was a big deal that it was driven that far. So we got that. What did we learn? Well, we learned that I take meticulous care of this car, and I still had problems, right? I got on the road, and the transmission rear seal started leaking. And that's because some long time ago, somebody had replaced that seal, and they had assembled the torque tube improperly. They'd put a shim in it, and they didn't put the seal in properly on the torque tube. Now, I've owned this car for 12 years, so I know it's been like that for at least 12 years. But all indications are it's been that way for probably 30 years. I mean, it was old. Everything was very hard, the rubber and everything. So it hadn't been changed out in 12 years. It's probably more like 30 or 35 years ago that somebody replaced it, didn't know what they were doing, and put it together improperly. The car ran all that time with an improper seal in the torque tube. Now, I usually drive this car 14 miles one way to work, shut it off, 8 hours later, drive it 14 miles home. The car never really got hot, so I never really knew that I had a problem. all of these cars leak a little bit. They seep oil everywhere. They have felt gaskets on the engine, and because of that, they seep oil. And you really, it's just part of owning an old car. You can reseal them, and they're still going to seep. And this one always seeped a little bit of oil. It seeps oil around the oil pan. It always seeped a little on the transmission. It's just the way it was and is and will be. I mean, it's just the way it is. So at the Motor Works in DeKalb, we got that fixed. Mark Huff's craftsmanship. The judges, when they judged this car, had no idea what had happened less than 24 hours before. It passed with flying colors because of his attention to detail at the Motor Works in DeKalb. So, as you know, on the way up, had a flat tire on the rear, and it turned out the reason I had the flat tire back here is because the tube gave way. So these tires have tubes in them, and the tube for some reason failed on that brand new tire and tube. And so when we got to DeKalb, we ordered 2 more tires and 2 more tubes, and everything's ready to go now. And we were ready to get back on the road. So once we left Auburn, we drove a full day without a problem. And then the next day, we have a heater core problem right here. And now the heater core is bypassed. You can see the hose coming here and going around in a circle. It's bypassed so it doesn't get into the heater core. Well, what did that do? Well, that put antifreeze inside the cabin. So I'm going to have to scrub that out, get that off the carpet. And it was leaking right up there underneath the fire extinguisher. You can see the lines coming down. And the only reason I saw that, the car wasn't overheating or anything. I stopped for gas, and I was on an incline where the passenger side of the car was down a little bit. Saw antifreeze coming out of the door. And I said, uh-oh, I got a problem. That's when I went to Roy's garage in Livingston, and they fixed the car. They bypassed it. Very nice people, took good care of me. And then I drove the final day home without incident. That heater core happened at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was back on the road by 10. I mean, just fast service, really good. Back on the road by 10 o'clock, and I drove all day that day, and then I had 380 miles the final day, and drove it home. Now, with this car, I didn't drive interstates, I drove secondary roads. I put into the Google Maps that I wanted to avoid highways, and Google Maps truly does avoid highways. If there's an alternate secondary road that they can take, they will. They keep you off of interstates completely. You might be on a highway, which is not a problem. This car really shines at 50 miles an hour. 45 to 50 miles an hour is where it likes to run. It doesn't like to run at 60. It's too fast for it. Wasn't designed for it. It's at its best where it drives for 5 to 10 miles and then comes up to a stop sign and takes off again. It works perfectly that way. If you get on a long stretch of highway and just run at a steady speed, like say we're on Route 19 here in Ocala, which is a 4-lane highway, and the speed limit is 60, and I'm running at 50, and I run for, say, a couple hours at 50 miles an hour, the car begins to heat up a little bit. Now, it isn't hot, but where the gauge normally runs over toward the cool, 1/4 of the way up, the gauge will get to the halfway point and a little bit more. And so you can see the gauge now is all the way to the left. It'll come about halfway to the center. And that's where it runs most of the time. But if you get on a steady highway and steady speed for a couple hours, it'll begin to creep up to the middle and maybe a little bit over the middle. So it's hotter than it should be, right? And that's because this car doesn't have a fan shroud, and it's not designed for that. It was designed for, 5 to 10 miles, stop, start up again. That's the way roads were in the 40s, and that's the way this car was designed to run. It does not have a fan shroud. It does not have the other amenities to keep it cool. And as long as I did that, everything was fine. But if I would have tried to run this on the expressway, it would have overheated. I would have had a problem. You just can't do that in a 75-year-old car. The other thing I found out is that in Florida and Alabama, in the middle of July, it is very hot inside the cabin. Now you get up to Illinois and Indiana, it's not as bad. It's okay without air conditioning. The folks that drove these cars were used to that. They didn't have a problem, but it took a little bit to get acclimated to it. It also, after driving the car a couple of days, and usually I'd have a 10-hour day. That's about what I drove. With stops, I would stop. Each time I stopped, I'd stop for a half an hour. So I'd stop at a gas station and I'd stop for a half an hour. I'd get out of the car and walk and just, fool around, and then get back in the car and drive. So I just took my time, but it was a 10-hour day. And after driving the car, first couple days, I noticed my arms were tired. Well, that's from seesawing on the wheel. These cars, even though they've got good suspension and everything, the way it's supposed to be in 1948, you're still seesawing the wheel. I mean, that's just the way it is. You're going down the road and you're correcting all the time, even with radial tires. So I noticed that in my arms. Arm strength is much better now after 10 days of being on the road with Sophie. Would I do this again? Yes, I would. I would drive this car anywhere. I've always said that. Sure, I had problems. Not any more problems than newer cars that are towed into my shop every day have. The problems that I will fix now, the transmission's already fixed. We'll fix the heater core. And the next trip, what else can go wrong? Well, I guess we'll find out. There's always something that could go wrong. But the other thing is, if you've got an old car like this, every time that I had a problem, people just came out of the woodwork to help you. When I had the flat tire, no less than 4 people stopped before the tow truck got there with the jack to help me change it. Stopped to give me a hand asked me if I needed help. When I would just pull off the road to look for directions, people would stop. Can I help you? Is there anything I can do for you? The car disarms people. They're not afraid of you. And they are there to be helpful. You're not a threat to them. You're a curiosity, and they want to help. If you've got a 1948 Buick Super, drive it. Take it to shows, but drive it every day. Just take it to work. Take it out to dinner. These cars are meant to be driven. The more they're driven, the better they are. I looked at a lot of the cars at the car show, and I said, those cars are trailer queens. They've never been on the road. They've never been sorted out. The best cars are the cars that are sorted and driven. And this is an awfully, awfully good car, as evidenced by the judging and by making it 2,500 miles. That's a testament to a 75-year-old car. If you've got a classic car, drive it. If you've got a classic car and you want to drive it, bring it to Pals. We'll make it right so that you can do that. See you soon.